This is
when
your
we're
chance.
live. This is your last chance.
This is your opportunity. Get it.
This is your last chance to say secret things.
Yeah.
All right. I have feedback that says we look live. So.
Oh.
Yeah, and we got viewers. They're coming in, so
right.
it looks like we're good. So hello out there, Lemonade Land. This is your, I don't know what to call the third refill. Should we be having third refills on our lemonade? Yes, we should. This is our third lunchtime chat refill style. Everyone but me has, I think, lemonade. Show it. No, don't show it. Don't show it. I've got the drink of doctors. We all know that I drink the drink of doctors. Right, there we go. There we go.
Cherry lemonade.
Cherry lemonade, the refill. Welcome, lemonaders. I hope you're having a great 3 days. I know I am, and I watched as much as I could, and I still have so much more to watch. So I hope this is wonderful for you. We have such a good panel today, and it's been really fun for me to host all three. So thank you to the powers that be that let me do this. Our panel today, I didn't pre-plan any adjectives, so it is the lovely Denise Fenzi, it is the lovely Kamal Fernandez, and it is the lovely Sharon Carroll. You all just get to be lovely because I have no imagination. And we're going to be talking about arousal and such. But before we get straight into that, I'd like people to know what it was you taught here at Lemonade, whether you have one coming up or whether you've already done it so people can go back and see. So Denise, what did you, I think you were doing something with puppy biting, weren't you?
Yeah, puppy or piranha. So basically
right.
raising puppies who give you a run for your money, kind of talking about what's great about them, what's not so great, how to pick a high drive puppy, and some basic strategies to get you through until they're less piranha and more dog. It was fun. It was a great one. So I hope some of you will go on over and watch my recording.
Yeah, I missed that one, and that's one I want to go back to because I have you've taught me a lot about how much we can let development happen and not necessarily make a federal case about it all. Kamal, what did you teach, or are you coming up? I can't remember.
I taught this afternoon early today.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, using play as a reinforcement essentially, and all the things that you can do with it. And it's something that obviously I love the concept of play and using it as reinforcement. So it was good. It was fun. Loads of great questions, by the way. Really, really, really good questions. So thought-provoking questions from my end, which is always stimulating. So hopefully people on this might ask some good questions.
Well, yeah, and I think we're famous for just such a smart group that comes in. So the questions are really my favorite part. I'm glad we're recording them this year. That's such a great bonus. And Sharon, I caught yours. I know you taught already. Tell everybody what you taught so they can go back and catch it if they missed it.
Yeah, I was at the end of day one, and it was arousal and the all-important threshold. So the first half was really just about arousal and what's really happening in the body, and the next little bit was about sports dogs and how arousal affects performance, and then the last bit was about arousal in our managing behavioural issues.
Right. And, all three perfectly, like reasonable and easy to delve into subcategories, right? Because they're intersecting all over the place. And that brings us right to this. How convenient. Didn't mean to, just kind of went clockwise or counterclockwise on my end. But that brings us right to what we want to talk about. A subject I know that you all three really spend a lot of time thinking about and have a lot of intersection around. And that I think is often pretty misunderstood, why this is such a good topic for us all to talk about, because I think people mean different things by the word. I think people feel different things about their dog getting that label. Like there's all kinds of I don't want to say misinformation, but varying information out there. So I kind of am always very tempted to start with defining our terms. That's the nugget, the question underneath all of it is, what are we talking about when we're talking about arousal? Before we talk about whether it's normal, what is it? Is this something we should be distinguishing from just physical energy, or are we conflating them? And what are your opinions there?
I'm going to help Denise on this one because Denise came up with a really great, which I was like, that's the perfect articulation of drive versus arousal. I can't verbatim. Denise will pitch in, I'm sure, but it was drive has a purpose, arousal not so much, and I'm sure Denise will expand on it. So I'm going to bow to her explanation.
Yeah, what I say is drive. You can't have drive without arousal, but you can certainly have arousal without drive. Mm-hmm. So the trick here, I think we can all agree on this panel, arousal is not a bad thing. And sometimes we talk about it as if it is a bad thing, but the fact is, if you have no arousal, you're dead. There's nothing. You're not functioning. And if you want to do dog sports, I think most of us want higher levels of arousal than we want in our pet dogs, because we do want our pet dogs to act like they're dead a lot of the day, right? We want them to sleep, doing
Mine
nothing.
are over there. They're dead.
You know, I'm keeping my fingers crossed here. But I think for those of us who do dog sports, there's really no way around arousal. But it's kind of two sides of a coin, right? So drive is focused arousal, then what is over arousal. And the topic here is over arousal. And so the one thing I would throw out, normal and abnormal, I'm starting to really rethink the value of those words, because everything is on a spectrum. Normal Absolutely. For what? For who? For the dog? For the handler? And just because the handler can't keep up does not mean the dog is over aroused. It means the handler can't keep up. But then what about in circumstances where the dog is perpetually in a state, let's say stuck there, well beyond anything that could be functional? Well, how do we decide what's normal? What's normal for a beagle? Is that what's normal for a Malinois? And why are they different? And how do you even know?
Well, there's so much right in that, right? And that's traversing the entire space. And so, you know, arousal and drive being different, yes. And I really have my own ideas of definitions of those. I'd love to hear your definitions. But I'm also thinking, is arousal just energy? As in, I am physically aroused. Like right now, I am physically aroused. One could argue, and we're not going to talk about stress because that brings up a whole other can of worms of definitions. But is arousal just physical energy, or are you guys, when you're thinking about training dogs, and Sharon, I'm going to ask you about the bell curve in just a second, but when you guys are training, are you thinking about arousal just as physical energy, up, able to enact behaviors, able to do stuff? I'm awake to a certain degree, like I am activated. Or are you thinking of arousal as a different thing because you only want so much of it and too much of it gets a problem? Like, is it fair to say that it's energy if we take out the drive part, or is that kind of off base for how you intersect with dogs?
Well, for me, like arousal is it's a process, and it goes from exactly what you're saying, from sleep to awake to, you know, highly aroused when the situation warrants it. Arousal itself is both physiological and psychological, and its purpose is just to generate that alertness, that mobility, that readiness to respond that's required for whatever the task is in front of you. So the arousal itself is just going to reflect the predicted energy that's required for whatever that task is. Now, traditionally, of course, in evolution, that task was to escape something that was trying to get you, or to chase something you were trying to eat, basically. But, you know, it's so much more complex than that. In terms of drive, for me, drive is just channeled arousal. It's just arousal that has a purpose. It's going somewhere. It's very goal-oriented, whereas arousal itself is just arousal.
It's just arousal. It's like a I think of it physiologically, although I don't know that I'm right about it. But I know that and I don't know the words for talking about a psychological component, because I can be super physically, the physical body, not very active or aroused, but being very mentally incredibly engaged in something I'm doing. I'm a very busy person inside. Maybe Denise is too. I don't know the other two of you, but we can be sitting quietly. I'm not energetically going to run anywhere. Right? That's me. Yeah. So I'd love it if we had a word for that, right? Because that's not drive either. That's some other physiological activation.
Well, I do call that drive. Like if a sheepdog is staring at sheep and not moving, because the sheep aren't moving, there's no reason for the dog to move. The dog is still in a very high, because it's ready to move. So the thing is, I would say, what is the appropriate behavior for the arousal at the time? And sometimes it's not moving. The start line and agility, a sheep about to work. So it's not physically externally moving. Now, fortunately, from my point of view, most of dog sports involve movement. So we very quickly start to equate arousal with physical energy. But those of us who have dogs who can't stop start to recognize it's not so simple. And that sometimes arousal is actually not moving, but the brain. And then some dogs really struggle, because once they stop moving, they start to stew. And in the process of stewing, they start to forget that they have a task in front of them. I was talking about ADHD the other day. It's very similar. Story of my life as a child. I would start to listen, and then the topic would get a little slow, and I would lose attention. And by the time I came back, I was now too far behind and couldn't catch up. And I think some of our dogs, they remind me of that.
Right. And if you don't have that focus that you're calling drive, and because in so many ways we plant an idea on a term, right? We have to spend the time to just agree that we're talking about the same thing. And I realize other people put other definitions to the word, but once we establish that we're talking about the same thing, then you can do all your problem solving or do all of your training, right? Because when I think about drive, and I wonder if you would find me off base on this, I think of that as not necessarily just the focus, but that I want that reinforcer. Because when I think in the human model, like a person who's let's say a lawyer with a desk job might be very, very driven for achievement or driven for money, let's say, but very low arousal. So you might be, I'm driven to get this reinforcement. I want this money from this situation. I'm driven for my reinforcer, but it's not an energetic process for me. It's a desire to have the thing I'm going to get. Mm-hmm. And that's what I've been working with.
To think about, because that's sort of a settled in, like the money is a long-term goal there.
Right.
And I think of arousal as being more focused on a short-term, what's the step in front of me?
Yes.
I think Sharon mentioned that drive always has a goal. And I tend to think, at least in terms of dogs, as a goal being, it's almost in hand. It's within the next several minutes. It's like the cookie that you're about to put in your mouth, not the one that's in the box as you drive home. You know what I mean? It's that bite of the cookie. That's what I think of with dogs.
But can you be high drive and low energy? And I feel like you should be able to be, but I don't know that I ever see it. Yeah. I mean, I feel like I could be high drive toward my reinforcers, but not interior, where it doesn't require energy, you don't have it there. Like high drive for maybe the livestock guarding dog, high drive for what it's going to get, but it's not a highly energetic
I would definitely say that's possible because certainly with my boxer, he's a dog, he definitely has drive, but he's a low energy dog. So his drive is very specific for certain aspects of play or bite work. Like he likes to fight, but he would no more get friends. And I had a Malinois actually years ago that was very similar, that didn't react to prey drive. He just didn't get stimulated by it. And the more they tried to activate the dog, the more he just went, that's just like a counterintuitive behavior. So traditionally how bite work is taught is the dog will be held in a harness and somebody will run around and try and stimulate the dog, and both those dogs went, what's the point? They had a measured attitude to it. They just weighed up and went, that's stupid, I'm on a lead, I'm being held. And both the various helpers that tried to work them, who had trained primarily prey driven, high drive dogs, German Shepherd working line, just couldn't understand them. But the people that had worked Rottweilers and more bull breeds, they absolutely understood them because their drive wasn't frenzied. It was like
exactly, and it's sort of like
it was so interesting to watch the difference of the people that understood that type of dog, and yet both of those dogs had drive, but it was just very like my other Malinois, like Jungle and Thriller. Oh, you back tie them and they're like hitting the end of the lead over anything, a piece of kibble, and they're going crazy. I'm not saying either there's not a pro or con of either dog. It's just understanding them. So to your point, I absolutely think you can get low energy dogs, but very driven.
Very driven. If we say drive is I want the thing, and then there's how aroused am I physiologically doing this, and then how fractured am I? Am I actually focused on the thing, or am I not able to do that? And they seem to be like sliders we can, not control, but that we can appreciate in a dog. And maybe you want high drive, X energy for your thing, and high arousal focus. So like I try to think of them as like bits and pieces.
But some of that's that idea of a slider. You go.
Oh, I like that idea because I think of like there's an anxiety scale, which is often confused. There's an arousal scale, which is often confused. There's a drive scale, which is often confused. There's an energy scale. And all of these things are definitely related, but they're distinct. And I've certainly seen dogs high anxiety, low arousal. Those are the internal dogs that just kind of, but they're not moving. And then for sure. And then there's a frustration scale in there somewhere too, because there's some dogs that can work in very high arousal and can think and manage to keep they look wacko, like tied back, like Kamal was saying with Cookie, but they can keep thinking. You give them a cue and they'll hit it. Whereas another dog might have that high arousal, but very quickly, it's not functional. It's not trainable because the dog's frustration takes over and it's tricky. And so when you think about all those sliders as things, like as a breeder, I'm thinking I want a little more of this, a little less of that, a little.
Absolutely.
Like I want arousal, but only if you're clear-headed and not frantic and can't think about what you want. I want high drive, but I don't want your drive to send you into paroxysms of fracturedness, right? So we want the pieces we want. And when we start saying all of that is called arousal, and then that dog is too aroused, we've lost meaningful ways to discuss what we can do to help a dog. I don't know if this lines up with biochemistry, Sharon. I don't know if it lines up with ideas at all that are more standard. They're just the way I think of them. So not necessarily right.
I think sometimes we're so caught up on just arousal, like as though it's this channel, like this vertical channel or horizontal channel. It's just low, moderate, high, over aroused. And then we forget to take the emotional component as a separate issue. So obviously to be highly aroused, there has to be an emotional component. It can be positive, it can be negative, but there has to be an emotion that's driving it, whether it's the dog's frustrated or whether it's excited, anticipating. There has to be an emotion involved. But then we have to sort of sometimes think, it's more like for sort of quadrants, it's more like, we can think of sort of the top two as being high arousal, say, and the bottom two squares as being low arousal. But we still have maybe the things on the left being our negative valence emotions and our things on the right being our positive valence emotions. So a dog can be highly aroused because it's anticipating reaching its goal, it's excited, it's in a positive valence emotional state, or it can be highly aroused because it's fearful, or it can be highly aroused because it's frustrated, both of those being negative valence states. Now, frustration still can work in our favor for sports dogs because we can channel that. And as long as they can attain their goal, as long as we make sure that frustration is at a level where they get success and they, then we can actually push them for more frustration and they get success, and so they'll keep in the game. But if we get them frustrated and they don't get success, then we get concerned that that dog's going to potentially then be, and this is, I think, often where it gets confusing, because for humans, we look at an animal that's really still, for example, like we often say, shutting down, stressing down. Like we look at those dogs that are in that anxiety and sort of fear-based sometimes, but mainly anxiety states that are behaviorally inhibited. They're slow moving, they're stopping, they're vacantly staring. We all know those sort of dogs. But technically, from a biological point of view, that's high arousal. Those dogs can be highly aroused, but instead of going to behavioral activation, they go to behavioral inhibition. So when we still look at the biochemistry and we look at what's happening in the brain, those dogs are highly aroused.
Still
like
way
they're
up,
on
right.
edge.
You can have high cortisol and no physical movement. You can be absolutely jacked and holding on to your cookies entirely. You can be.
And so sometimes those dogs get missed because their idea when they get frustrated is just avoidance or shutting down or being disinterested. It doesn't mean they're not frustrated. It doesn't mean they're not at that high arousal, negative valence state. It's remembering that there's still, even in arousal, it's not just one channel. There's two sides to it still.
It's interesting
Somebody
you say that.
Asked me.
Go on, Denise. You go. Oh, I was just saying that's really reminded me of a point of when my former vocation, dealing with people in situations that had high levels of trauma, like violent crimes, etc. And they would just do exactly that. They were actually very, very aroused, but they would display it in a sense of like, I can't move, I'm going to freeze, I can't. But you could not connect with them. You couldn't reach them at all. So, in those situations, it's understand that's a extreme level of arousal, as much as the person that's like, on intoxicated, or et cetera, that person's, got the same sort of thing. And it's just, I think that's that the perception of arousal is frenzied hysteria, manicness, where actually it's being understanding of there is more than one version of.
And also in terms of solving it, that reminds me that like with some dogs, I find that moving them soothes their arousal, and with other dogs, stopping them soothes their arousal. And it's not obvious. It's not like dogs that stress up, well, you want to move those dogs or hold them still. In my house, Dice needs to hold still. If he moves, he goes through the roof, right? And I know that about him. Whereas my other two do much better if I move them. That helps them calm. And then both dogs benefit from the opposite at certain times. But just my go-to when they're over the top is to let them move their bodies and move away. And with him, my go-to is stop him from moving, which is fascinating because if you consider that the same is true in how one expresses arousal. Some stop moving and freeze, and others get hysterical and hyper. And it's not even tied to it. It's not like those who stop and freeze need to be moved necessarily, and those who move a lot need to be stopped necessarily. It's just you work with it and you try to figure out what gets this person breathing again normally.
Right.
Back to the middle. So overarousal can almost be overarousal hysterical and overarousal catatonic. It depends.
Yeah.
It can be. And it reminds me that, I mean, it just reminds my science brain that when we have more sliders to put into our analysis, even if they're hypothetical ones, just to allow for thought experiments, if there's more sliders in this, these sliders can be explaining why you see that kind of difference. So it could be that it's best to have stillness in X dog or in X populations when the frantic movement is making it worse because it's a stress related or negative valence, whatever. Or it's possible that movement makes it better if all we have is energy, but not worry in it or not, triggering for anxiety. So all you have is excess energy. Let me help you move it out. But you have instead stressed energy, like you're getting activated because of something not happy. Maybe you need to not move. And I'm not saying that's what I would do. I'm just saying because there's other sliders, when we think about if there's two dogs and it seems like one path works for one and one path works for the other, and you want to go, well, why? You don't look to that exact same thing. Like, I don't know, they're just different. You can say, okay, is there a third or fourth or fifth variable? Like, is the item they're trying to drive for right now, the reinforcement they want, is that present? Is it not present? Are they focused on it? Are they not focused on it? Like there's, the more sliders we can add into this, the more we can, I think, learn from the interesting choices you make, because you're making interesting choices with dice, and it's hard to know what to conclude from that. I mean, not that we know, but like you're always open saying, well, what should I conclude from this interesting thing that just happened? And it's like, the more sliders we put in, the more you can say, I wonder if it's this, and I wonder if it's that.
Yeah. And also just that sense of whatever I did yesterday, I never want to see that again. Like,
well, there is that.
I left a slider out, right? So,
this slider down to 0.
Yeah. Oh, look, this dog has the capacity for aggression. That's a slider, right? So what does one dog do under great frustration? Hit the ground and look sad. What does the next dog do? Tries to bite you. So having that extra information, and I don't tend to think in terms of good dogs and bad dogs. I think in terms of meeting the needs of the dogs, meeting the needs of the people, and trying to find some middle ground that makes everyone kind of happy. So I think almost all qualities have a good side. It's sometimes we have to look a bit and find that, but it's in there. But I'm sort of enjoying this slider approach. Like, I think we've gotten 5 so far.
There's plenty of them. I'm full of them.
The human being.
I got
Lots
plenty
of
of
sliders.
Because we're not.
I think about just the people. The people. It doesn't even matter how calm, crazy that dog is. If the person can't relate to the dog where it's at a given time. Yeah.
So it's really interesting you're talking about dogs that move. So jungle and thriller were dogs that you almost had, like, I equated to horses. Like, you have to lunge them when they'll come out frantic. You're better off just going, let's just lunge you for 10 minutes and then take the heat off you, and then you're functioning. And you could see them calm down when you had them in motion. And the reason I actually gravitate or I like that type of dog because that's very similar to my personality. I'm at my calmest when I'm being most active. Like, if I'm on, doing physical exercise, then I'm like, it's almost like, honestly, it's a meditative state. It's like I can think clearer. Everything's like my thought process is much calmer when I'm being physically challenged. And it's I who knows why the hell it is. It's just, and it's the myth that I think, coming back to what you were saying, it's interesting you're saying about school, Denise, that I think that dog training and education of children have so many parallels, in that the child that doesn't fit into that, cookie cutter mold of, well, you and I, Denise, were clearly had some sort of, probably ADHD or whatever you deem it now. I don't know what it would be called technically. And therefore you didn't fit in the mold. So you had a concentration problem. Every single report I ever had was, Kamal would be great if he could just concentrate, or
if he could just sit down.
Yeah, exactly. Every single report I had. And the ironic thing is, it's just like, and I see the same thing in my daughter. So I see the same thing in Neve, and that she has the same genetic traits. And it's interesting that the same parallels happen with dog training, unless the dog conforms to these structured processes rather than going, let's try and meet the dog, as Denise said, with where are they at? How can we help their needs? And being prepared to go a little bit off the beaten track. If your dog is running around, if your dog comes out the box hyper, okay, let's not necessarily make it then sit still for 20 minutes, because that might not be the right approach. I say might because it absolutely could be the thing, but you've almost got to be willing to go, let me try this and see what happens, and then review your training subsequently and make a decision based on that. Because in the moment, you're not going to be able to, sometimes you try something at a given situation and it absolutely works. I think that's what effective training is. It's being receptive to what the animal tells you to do, isn't it, really, as opposed to following a strict process.
Well, therein lies the art of training
Sharon
over the
and
science,
I have
right?
talked about.
Yeah,
So much of it really is you just have to try.
Yeah.
I mean, even like matters of threshold, the way you're going to find the threshold is by going over the threshold.
Yeah.
And this isn't something that we should feel bad about.
Yeah,
this is something we should celebrate as part of human learning, because humans, much more than dogs, can make a choice to take the negative event and say, awesome, look what I learned from that. That's a little hard on a dog. A dog is a toddler, right? A dog doesn't have the capacity to sit around saying, I didn't get my ball today, but that's okay, because I learned how, it's a dog.
Yeah.
Right.
But we can do that. And like, I find it hugely helpful to be able to talk to like Kamal or Sharon about whatever might be happening, because we can all agree that negative events are still learning for the human. It's just, what did you take from that? That you need to put your dog on the treadmill for 10 minutes. Okay, that's some information there. And that 20 minutes is so much the dog doesn't want to work. It's all good. It's all good information.
Well, it's all good information because it's in your hands. So like, if you have ethical guidelines on what you will and won't do and what you mean by over threshold, right? Like if you're talking about, I'm exploring a space where both sides of this threshold line that I think might be here, because I'm checking, are still both safe places. I can ask this question, right? It's different from, if you didn't have that guideline, if you weren't thinking those things, you might be making mistakes that you really regret. I mean, we're not setting ourselves up to make mistakes on purpose. I don't think anyone's saying, I will put them over threshold just to see, right? But sometimes life happens, right? So learning how to put yourself in a place where your recovery or a mistake of your own or a mistake of your dog's won't be catastrophic in some way is what experience gives you, right? That's why you're able to do what you're doing, and why some people get into trouble when they're messing. I think
there is such a fear of error within training for certainly inexperienced trainers. I think there is such a fear of certainly, I'd say more than years gone by, of the dog must never be over threshold, errorless learning, which is great. All that makes perfect sense, but it's to actually have that in a reality, in a real world, I think can sometimes be counterproductive, because often the trainer is so inhibited by making mistakes. They're afraid to try. And I know my own personal experience as a dog trainer, being a balanced trainer going into a reinforcement-based dog trainer. My greatest learning was from making some serious F-ups and getting it totally wrong and having to rework this whole thing. And it really educated me, sometimes not necessarily for that dog, but for other dogs, and the learning from it. I look at the steep learning curve from my first Mally to my second. It was like catastrophic. Like I absolutely went, that dog showed frustration when he did things like shaping. And I was like, okay, I'm going to avoid this, because what his default behavior was, I'm going to bite you. Or if I'm not going to bite you, which he understood, don't bite me, he went, I'm going to bite whatever's close by. If it happens to be furniture, an item, whatever, it's getting bitten. And I was like, oh, and he was a colossal, huge dog, and he was a powerhouse of a dog. And it was just, he essentially shaped me to go, just don't go there, because the repercussions isn't worth it. But the fallout from that was, it actually created within him learned helplessness. So when he hit a struggle, I would ride in there on my white horse going, oh my God, please don't bite anything or anybody. I will save you. So the short-term game was, I in one way, I kept the dog from biting things in that context, but I actually didn't help the dog be able to work through that frustration. I learned that drastically with my second Mally, and I was determined with her to work through that process. And I swear, and I've had this conversation with Denise, she was the dog that she was because of that entity in her training. She had the ability, and she was definitely more She would have been absolutely reactive. She would have been dog aggressive, and she was amazing because of being able to teach her how to deal with those things in a much more cognitive manner, not just be impulsive, which is very much the breed. But I mean, I don't know whether that's anecdotal or what, but my experience with dogs definitely shaped my training.
Like this over threshold thing, Sharon, I want to ask you a bit about this because, you know, Kamal, what you were just saying, and Denise, about working over a threshold and how that can freeze people because we're so afraid of it or whatever. There's no, just like arousal, there's no one definition of threshold, because which threshold are you talking about? And, you know, I don't want to work dogs over a threshold of stress. I don't mean distress. I don't just mean arousal. I don't want to work dogs over a threshold of when they feel unsafe. I don't want to work dogs over a threshold of where they can't be learning what I'd like them to learn from this thing I'm doing, instead learning something else, like how to get away or how to defend themselves. But that's not the same thing as working over an energetic threshold that I don't maybe know how to contain, or an energetic, you know, a threshold of, there's so many, as many states and sliders as we just had, they all have thresholds that you cross. And so when we say a dog is over threshold, I would love us to say, I mean over the fear threshold, in which case I don't work them. But I also mean over the maybe stimulation, arousal, physiological energy, arousal threshold. Yes, they're over it. And maybe I'm overmatched right now, but I'm not making a mistake of teaching a dog to be threatened or fearful. So when I think of threshold, I'm trying to think between what and what, not just it's a state where we are now over it, you know, like over it in what way? So how do you work with threshold in your working definition, Sharon?
I think that probably comes back to what we were saying before about recognizing that there's the two sides. There's the positive valence emotions, the negative valence emotions. You might be fine with pushing a dog that's in that positive valence emotion to a point where they're going past threshold. And does it really matter? They're just having fun. They're so excited. They're off their face. That's fine. But are we going to push a fearful dog past threshold? Ideally not. So then it comes back to what's the emotion, what's the motivation driving the arousal, because that's going to have a big impact on how comfortable I am as to when they go over threshold. And then in terms of what is over threshold, we just put a definition on it, and everybody's would be slightly different. That's the honest truth, because over threshold isn't a thing. It's when it's a scale in that it happens over a period. It's not like it's a moment in time. But what really happens is you've just got less cognitive, you've got less thinking happening, and more instinct and emotion. So the entity, whatever species it is starting to operate much more on instinct and emotion and much less on thinking. Now, if you've put a lot of training in there, they don't need a lot of thinking. So your sports that usually work with high arousal, so say your bike sports, as long as the dog's very practiced, they can work at very high arousal because
and not be over threshold.
And be functioning and be fully functioning and competing and doing what you need them to do. So I mean, in terms of like my definition, I guess most people somewhat would agree with it in terms of behavior modification would be, as soon as I have a dog that's not thinking, that can't follow instruction, that I'm giving a known cue and there's just no dog there. They're just like either looking vacantly at me, they've got no idea what I'm talking about, or, you know, they're so active that they just can't function, or they're so frozen solid and staring in space that they can't function. So as soon as I've got a dog that can't follow a known cue, probably is rejecting food because of the sympathetic nervous system sort of causing the digestive system to reject food. But not always, because some dogs will redirect onto the food. So they'll start snapping at the food, but it's not really actually the same as a dog that's eating. It's a dog that's redirecting onto food, or redirecting onto a toy, or redirecting onto the person. Tipping into aggression would be another thing, or completely zoning out. Those dogs that go, like we were saying before, super high arousal, but they go to behavioral inhibition. And all of a sudden, I mean, we've all been there. You have a dog, but there's just no dog. You're talking to them. You can be poking them and tapping and waving your hand in front of their face. You can wave a barbecue chicken in front of their face. There's nothing. There's no dog there because they're so highly aroused and they've zoned out. They're just not functional.
And this is
why it doesn't always have activity.
It's not always obvious, but this is why it would behoove all of us. And I think all of us and all of, not even sure I should put us in it, but everybody who's competing at high levels, everybody who's working with dogs who have to give performances, have things that are in the realm of ready to work. Are you ready to do this? Can you do this? Do you want to do this? And can you do this? And once they say, I want to and I can, and I don't feel afraid, then if you have problems. You have a different set of problems. You have maybe a training problem. You have maybe a handling problem. You have maybe you were not clear. Your dog wants something else. Your dog is highly energetic, but has said to you, I want to, I know what we're doing. And so many times when someone says my dog is over threshold or my dog is highly too aroused, is over aroused, they're not drilling down to these pieces. Are you sure your dog feels safe? Are you sure your dog can do what you're asking? And has your dog had any practice at learning some of these skills? So yes, we should never work dogs over threshold, but that doesn't mean that has the same definition at all times, in all dogs, in all scenarios, with all valences, with, so it becomes one of these words that don't help us.
That's what I was going to say. The problem, as I say, with our industry is the necessity to label things like reactivity, over threshold, arousal. And it's so simplistic and there's so many more layers to it than that. It's like, we want to put the label on, put it on a tin, and that's the end of that conversation. And it's frustrating because you think, well, it's not that simple. It's not that simple to go, right, the dog's over threshold, that's the end of the conversation. And it's then what happens when you have labels, you have the stigma and the judgment that goes with it because, your dog is over threshold. The obvious thing is to do da, da, da. Well, that's not necessarily the case.
It's not always going to be the case, right?
Absolutely. And it's, I mean, this conversation in itself is great that we're saying we need to be more open to the concept that the label needs to be not discarded because it's a starting point, but it needs to be explored. It's like having a label and tin. You look at the back and go, what's it actually made of?
What's in it? Right. Yeah, where are our sizes? How much of that is in there? Yeah.
The label is just part of the conversation. The label is over threshold. Okay, let's have a look at why that is. Because in certain situations, like as Sharon, articulated, there's, if your dog is over threshold because it's fearful, of course, you're going to take a totally different approach to the dog that's over threshold because of, I don't know, it's a flyball tournament and it's going hysterical. You're going to take those two things very differently, But I think the thing of labels, you need to really look at the back of the tin, to be truthful.
I think people are thinking that threshold means the dog got scared. The dog is, has changed emotional states from it was in a good place, now it's in a bad place. I think that is a very common, and so that's why the advice gets to be pull the dog away from that. Let's not do this anymore. And people aren't making space for he didn't change necessarily the emotional valence. He's changed maybe his ability to handle or do this thing, but that doesn't mean that he now feels afraid. Sometimes he does, sometimes he doesn't. And if you don't know
reactivity. And we make it that black and white. We say, I hear this all the time. Almost all reactivity is fear-based. I hear this all the time. I don't agree. I just don't agree. I look at my dog's behavior and I look at how he looks when he chases a squirrel. And I look at how he looks when he chases a car or wants to. And I look at how he looks when he looks at a dog. And I'm telling you, they look really similar. So I'm struggling with the idea that he's afraid of the squirrel, afraid of the rabbit.
No, I don't think
so. He's simply in a bad space.
I think
I want us to talk and explore
absolutely.
The possibilities.
But those of us who I try to have a lot of voice in the space of reactivity, and when I'm asked, I say things like, if you're going at a squirrel, I don't care if it's barky lungy, if you're going at a squirrel, I personally am not going to call that reactivity. I'm going to call that something else. So that way I can say things like a lot of reactivity is fear, because the other thing of it, I'm going to give it a different, maybe not a different name, but I'm going to say you can't be reactive to a squirrel. Granted, you're reacting. I mean, I know the English word is that you are reacting, but I'm not going to call that reactivity. I'm going to save that for when I have a behavioral problem that is more in the, fear or insecurity realm or whatever. We can do this if we have paragraphs and not words.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I do think fear, because it's so important not to hurt an animal, I'm always going to assume fear if I have no more to work with, right? It's always better to be safe than sorry.
Yeah.
But if the evidence starts to mount and I say, you look at dogs the same way you look at squirrels, then I'm going to start questioning my assumption of fear in the presence of dogs or people, right? Like, gee, when a jogger runs by, you look at that like you look at a squirrel. And it at least has given me, and I've had interesting conversations with people about this, about rethinking what we mean, even by the words and by our tendency to treat them all the same, regardless of the underlying emotion. And I would love to see a lot more focus on people trying to understand what's what is the underlying emotion. Is it a happy one or an unhappy? So my willingness to put my dog in situations where he's clearly over threshold, but he wants to get to the things, the squirrels, And then I'm feeding and he's calming himself down very nicely. And I look at his expression. He doesn't look fearful, adds weight. But if I ever see anything that makes me think maybe he is fearful, that's a problem. Or if his brain falls out and there's nothing going on with my chicken, that's a problem.
And then you can't find it. You're picking it up. And where is it? Where is the brain?
We got a problem.
I mean,
but I love the more layered approach to the conversation.
Yes. Yeah. And if we sort that out, and go ahead, Sharon. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, definitely, I see, and I'm an absolute advocate for being very acutely aware of fearful dogs or anxious dogs. I mean, it's a field I work a lot in. And so it's not for a second that I'm dismissing that, but I do see an awful lot of people out there, quote unquote, counter conditioning a dog that really just has a chasing, like a desire to do the chasing, a desire to be reactive. The dog's leaping, lunging, barking, but it's not because of any sort of fear. And so they're out there sort of going, oh, counter condition this. I'm like, you can't counter condition this. The dog's already happy. It's already positive. You add food, that's not going to do anything. You
stay
can add food.
Operant.
Yeah, you have to stay operant. It's really hard because a lot of people are really pushed to believe that if the dog's reactive, there's going to be a fear component. And I'd say, I'd say you have to really assess, is there a fear component or not?
Denise and I, talk about, buckets in this sense, in the same way, in the sense of you're happy and unhappy. And I often want to give it to people as, in this bucket, I can let you feel what you're feeling. I don't know exactly what it is. Is it happiness or is it, some other thing that I can't put a pin in? I don't know what it is. Are you prideful? I don't have to know. If I think that you're in a state that I can allow to continue, I think you're okay and I can let this go on. That's one set. And the other set is, I don't want you to continue to experience this. You're in a bucket, whatever the emotion is, whether it's fear or frustration or anger, or I don't know because I'm not a dog or a mind reader. But if your emotions are in a category that say, I don't want you to continue feeling this way, I need to do something that's different from, I can let you continue to feel this way. And then I'm absolved of having to figure out which emotion this is. It's just, is this okay to go with? Are you feeling all right? Or are you not? And I don't know if it's fear or something else, but I don't want you to keep feeling this way. So we're going to take different actions now, right? And it simplifies it into the two buckets. I know we talk differently, but similarly about that. It's like, there's just two, not that there's just two, but it helps us organize what we're going to do instead, right? I think the more we can give people power to make good decisions, not just think over threshold, can't do this, or I think it's a fear, so now I give cookies. Like there's nuance to this that we can be adding as people who think through these things.
Yeah. One thing I do like, I have found thinking in terms of arousal quite useful personally lately, because what arousal level do I want in my house? How can I raise it or lower it? What arousal level do I want when I'm training for bite sports? How can I raise it or lower it? What arousal level do I want in the presence of other dogs? How can I raise it or lower it? What arousal level do I want when I'm doing behavior work? And the techniques are all the same, but my expectations and my comfort level vary depending on what I'm trying to do. And so I've actually found it super useful if my dog doesn't do something, asking myself, is he too low in arousal? Is he too high in arousal? Because low is bored, high is frantic, right?
Right. And then a couple of other sliders you can add now.
Yeah. I do 1 to 10 arousal. And I think for this activity, I want you at a solid 8. I want some speed here. How am I going to get you a little higher before I send you? And for this activity, I want scent work. I want to drop your arousal before I even start the activity, because I think your odds of succeeding, and I want success, are going to be better. And then over time, I mess with that. What happens if I send you for scent articles and you're a little too high? Good, because I can't push your boundary. I can't push your capacity to work in a broad range of arousal states unless I practice them. But I can't go from, if you're happy at a 2, I can't put you at an 8. I can put you at a 3. And when you can do a 3, I can put you at a 4. And I've actually really enjoyed thinking about this and exploring my options, because they're not as straightforward as I thought. Like if
you're at a
9,
2,
I can't get them to a 2.
And you want an 8, you might be moving a whole bunch of sliders to get there rather than just the one you're really interested in, which is physical activation or concentration. You might be trying to get them to 8 and stressing them the heck out. And now you have the stress slider at 8 or the distress slider at 8. And these are, again, metaphorical, but that's why you have to think about these things. I want this from my dog, but how I get there might be getting me in trouble or might be serving my needs. And that's I feel like what you're
increasing. Yeah, it could actually be just adding anxiety. Like if you jolly your dog and pick and poke and edge, you'll raise anxiety, which does raise arousal. but that's not going to get you a clear head. So that's not quite right. And I do know, at least for this dog, it's really easy to bring him up. I can go from a 2 to an 8, but I can't go from an 8 to a 2. I can go from an 8 to a 7 to a 6 to a 5 to 4.
Yeah.
And I would imagine there are other dogs who stress the opposite direction.
Yes.
And it's probably very easy to drop them out of arousal, but quite hard to get them back, which is, you have dogs at the dog show where you take them from the grate, you get them as hyper as you can, you get to the ring as fast as you can, and you get through it because on a good day, you got 4 minutes to work with, and then the dog is ready for a nap. That's all you got. Then you got another dog, you bring the treadmill to the dog show, you stick it on the treadmill for 20 minutes, you run it some more, and you still hope that there's 20 more minutes before you go in the ring. And all because some dogs go up easily, some dogs come down easily. But I definitely have had, my mental model has become easier when I think in terms of what's the right arousal for this circumstance, and less about the actual behavior I'm observing, more about what does this tell me? Your ears, your eyes, your mouth, your breathing, how fast are you wagging your tail? How much are you looking around? That I'm finding easier to interpret than actually behavior. I'm almost putting what kind of arousal do I have here? And is it anger? Is it?
Yeah. But don't you? I think we've had this conversation independently, Denise. That there's the misunderstanding, which hopefully is what this conversation about. It's very traditional in dog sports, certainly, to train with frustration. It's a very well used, well documented, well taught technique to create drive, or I'm going to rephrase that: create desire for the reinforcement by the means of frustration. So what you bake into the dog's emotional response to the thing, food, toy, etc., is frustration. So as soon as you bring that thing into play, the dog has a conditioned feeling, emotional state of frustration. And this was one of the discussions actually on the earlier conversation I was having on play, and saying my preference is to take the more scenic route, but create a much more healthier desire for the reinforcement, i.e., let's talk specifically on play, because that was what my talk was. I want my dogs to genuinely want the toy because they want the toy, not because there's a level of either deprivation or they must have it because there's a frantic, especially for some of the breeds I have. I want,
or they're self-medicating on the toy because of something else.
The flip side of that is certainly for let's say a bite work sport, is there's loads of emotions going on there anyway, depending on how you train, etc. You layer that with the dog's, never mind the dog in the environment, then you add to that the dog's conditioned response to the thing, i.e. the sleeve or the toy. Then you've got the conflict of the handler and your methodology. You can just see how it just is going to become a hot mess before you even step on the field. And so whilst this wasn't necessarily an issue with toys, with Jungle specifically, I had a major issue with her about arousal because she's obsessed. She loves people. She loves people to the point of it's ridiculous. She was like a Labrador on ease. It was ridiculous. So when I started foundation bite work with her, I did it for kibble in a pot, and the person that I used actually was Craig Ogilvie. It was like, no talk, don't say anything to her, you're going to feed her kibble for looking at you. And so all her prep work for bite work was done. It was taught, you're going to be in a harness, you're going to look for somebody else, they're going to feed you kibble. That was her layers of
for clarity reasons, for thoughts and for clarity.
So if I hadn't done that, bearing in mind simultaneously I was doing what I would call anti-people training, like don't talk to the dog, ignore the dog, because if you smiled at her, if you looked at her, if you gave her anything, it would be hysterical. And it wasn't a healthy I love people, it was a frantic I need to be it was not how I want my dogs to exist, in that unhealthy state of, whilst it appears endearing, and the misconception I think of looking at her, oh, she loves people. She doesn't. She loves people in an unhealthy place of appeasement. Yeah.
She doesn't know how to handle her feelings around people.
Not like a casual, oh, hi, I really like people. I have dogs that do that. I know what that looks like. With her, it was like an unhealthy state of response. Yeah. So that, coupled with, then I had a tug toy to it, that was just a hot mess waiting to happen. So my approach was, okay, let's first address let's do some anti-people training, so people are now boring, and we're going to do this bite work thing, but we're going to do it for kibble. Now, if you broach that to people in a traditional sense, they'd be thinking, what the hell are you doing? you're going to flatten the dog, da, da, da. And actually, the ironic thing is now she's got it's beginning to have a very clear, level head towards the process. Like she can engage, she can stand there calmly, she can hold the cushion, everything's manana, she can trot around. She's a baby, so she's got a lot of stages to go through. And I don't want to hang my hat on what I'm doing, but I just absolutely felt that her response to people was it was really, this sounds asinine, but it was concerning that she was that obsessed with people, because
it reminds me so much of what I'm doing with my dog. So your dog's response to people is my dog's response to all things predatory. So when the helper wants to take a toy and start moving it, I'm like, no, this has to stop.
Yeah.
I don't like how my dog is going wacko. They like it because it's look at all that. I'm like, no. This is not normal. This is going to put my dog at a 15 on a scale of 1 to 10. And we did no drive building with him. He bit. That's all. You get to bite things. We play. We let go. And it looks so different than all the other puppies running around chasing rags. I'm like, this is the least of my problems.
Exactly.
I want my dog. And I was feeding him while other people played and did tugs, adding distance. So it was like taking the prey out, because in my opinion, it was also not a healthy predatory behavior. It was a eyes turned black kind of. Yeah. I don't think that felt good inside of him.
Okay.
But that comes back to the recognition from, obviously, two super experienced, amazing trainers that are recognizing that there's a point at which more arousal isn't going to help you. Yet there's a lot of people out there that honestly go, my dog's not focused enough. Add arousal. My dog's not doing the job I want it to. Add arousal. Right. My dog, add arousal. It doesn't look like all the other dogs. Add arousal. It's like, whoa. Let's just be sensible here. There's times that reducing arousal is a sensible thing to do. There's times when we want to increase it. There's times we want to decrease it. We should be training them to be able to escalate and de-escalate. We should be training them. We should have cues so we can lower, so we can increase, but not just going. For me, I mostly see, for example, sports dogs people, a lot of them, especially, agility people and bike sports people, but just add arousal. Everything's going wrong, add arousal. And I'm like, that's not necessarily going to fix your problem.
That doesn't add clarity.
And then we
that's
see
not adding
pet
clarity.
dog
That's
people.
adding physiological activation, but that's not adding clarity.
See, like pet dog behaviors, everybody's almost the opposite. It's like low arousal. That's going to fix everything. Just low arousal. I'm like, you haven't got a dog that's suited to living at low arousal. That's like taking a really high energy person and telling them they have to live their whole life really quiet and placid. Right. It's not going to work. And so we have to realize that low arousal might be necessary. Decreasing arousal might be necessary. Increasing arousal might be necessary.
We're running out. We only have a few minutes left, and I really would hate to stop us. I was going to say, how would we ideally, if you could wave your magic wand, raise your puppy to have the proper relationship to their own arousal? But I feel like there's no way for you to just do that in a few minutes. But Kamal, you reminded me of it. So you did talk about how you're helping your puppy have arousal. If there's things people can take away from they're raising a puppy, they're raising their dog, and they want a proper relationship to this inside their dog, handling their own problems. If you have short-ish, we have 5 minutes. But I know, Denise, you do have thoughts about that. So
I'll get it. 1 minute. I got this. I owe Shade Weitzel and Sarah Brusky greatly for this. The idea from 8 weeks of age, all arousing activities had a pair that was lowering arousal. So we play tug, we play with tug, we get out food. And there's a video of me trying to stuff food in the back of my dog's mouth. My hands are bloody because he's not the least bit interested in letting go. He's screaming. He's clamped down on the toy, and I am not going to give up. I'm going to keep putting those hot dogs in until his mouth is so full. He finally lets go of the tug, and he eats. But I learned, if you've got something that takes your dog high, find a pair, take your dog low. And to this day, he can go from pretty hot to out cookie, drops it, immediately switch it. You can watch his whole face turn instantly. And I'm so grateful I taught that skill from day one.
So the ability to switch, getting in and out of different reinforcers can help a puppy in his relationship to arousal as he's growing up. Do you also have other sort of things if somebody's struggling with? They can struggle with, an adult dog after it's already been set, but if you're getting a new puppy, you're trying to think, I want you to be able to be excited, but also still be here with me and not lose your mind. Are there things you try to help your clients do or think it through when they have babies?
Who's that?
Sorry, is it to Kamal?
Either Kamal and Sharon, because it's your last wrap up before we have
Sharon,
to send them home.
Yeah, I just think exactly the same thing. It's a matter of making sure they can do both. Don't just drive. Don't just quiet. You've got to have both. You've got to be able to maneuver between the two. Yeah, as much as you can, really have those cues to do that and really understand the dogs need to be able to function at low arousal. All dogs have to be able to function at low arousal, but all dogs have to be able to function at high arousal as well. I don't think we should. And then for me, I think most importantly is having people recognize that just because a dog isn't physically being active does not mean it's not highly aroused. And this is what we see at, say, agility or obedience competition. The dog is shut down. The dog's uncomfortable. It's at massively high arousal. And they go, oh, look, he's at low arousal. Get the tug out. Quick, excite him. Jolly him up. Do something to make him more excited. I'm like, that dog's already terrified or it's overwhelmed. It's uncomfortable. Don't just shove the tug in its face. It may latch on because it may redirect onto the tug, but this is not where, we need to also factor in emotion, not just up and down, low arousal, high arousal, but really think which side are we on? Positive,
balance.
negative. Yeah.
Up, down, and balance. You have to, it's not a 2D, it's a 3D, it's not even a 2D space, it's a 3D space. You have a lot of things to consider. And I know, Kamal, you talked about the puppies as well. And I think that for those of you watching, the things I didn't ask them that you're going to go ask them privately is how they handle their dogs when their dogs are in different places. I wanted to get to when people don't have the skill for it, what should the people's skills start looking like? And I wanted to talk about breed intersections. Like, do we see this more in certain breeds than others? But we're going to have to table that, have an arousal part 2, because there's really so much to this. And I think all the viewers can see that this is an art. This is not just your dog crossed here, your dog did that thing, that's what's happening there. You have to be able to recognize a lot of different states and test for those kinds of things. If you have a ready to work protocol, you should be using it. If you aren't sure when you're recognizing distress from just eustress or activation, you should know those things before you're trying to work with dogs who are going to bring you a lot of physical energy and going to do things that energy that might be more than you can handle. These are skills you need to be putting together. And I think that's a thing that we all could agree, that the three of you could agree on. I mean, I don't know if I've overstated it, but it seems like that's what we can get from this. I hope this was a great talk for you guys. It was a great talk for me. I love being in the presence of people who do this so much. I hope you all in Lemonade Land learned stuff and love this. There's plenty more Lemonade to come. We still have, from my time, where I am in my time zone, we still have a 2 o'clock session, a 4 o'clock session, and a 6 o'clock session. So that means we've got 3 coming. And really just thank you all 3 for being here for this wonderful conversation. Thank all you Lemonaders for being here and our sponsors and all that. And for those who said I could do this, because I had the best time. I really did. Any parting things, or is it time to say goodbye? Are we good?
Just
like
to
we're
say,
good.
No, thank you so much, Amy. Thank you, Kamal and Sharon.
Thank you.
And it's been fun. It's been nice to talk about this conversation. Like you say, many more to come. Thank you very much, all.
It's been great. I hope we can do this again, public or private. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
I'm ending the stream now. I'm ending the YouTube stream. I'm ending it. And we're seeing it go. We're making sure that